Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is a live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, comedy on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app to your smartphone and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. Can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today. And dear friend of the program, Jimmy Keltner, I was talking to him a couple weeks ago, and I said, you've long talked to me about your mentors and guys that kind of were out in the LA area via Tulsa earlier than you, or at around the same time. And the names Blackwell and Karstein keep coming up. And are any of those cats still around? And he said, yeah, Jimmy's still around. He's like, here's his number. So I got a chance to call him and get a hold of him, and now he's on the program. Jimmy Karstein, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute honor to talk to you. You know, I wanted to ask you, I was talking to a journalist and radio host in Oakland, African-American guy named African Jamal Davies, and he is from Tulsa as well, and he talked about Leon Russell going to the north part of Tulsa, which at the time was a completely black run part of town. I mean, all the businesses were black run, all the clubs were black. You had different barbecue joints, and that's where he was going to check out music, and actually wound up moving back and buying a house, and and the rest is history. But did you, early on in your career, were you going into North Tulsa to check out the black music?
Yes. Although when I was in high school, I was a little bit young to be going, hanging out anywhere really, and but we went over there. We used to go over there, or we'd go over there for shows. They used to have a place called the Big Ten Ballroom and the Rose Room, and they'd have, acts like Ray. That's where I saw Ray Charles the first time, and at the Big Ten, and we would go over there. And I know one time it was late. Of course, Oklahoma was one of the last states to have legal liquor by the drink, and everybody the musicians always liked it that way because there was no closing laws in those days. They had, all that kind of control they hadn't thought about all that, and the places used to just go around the clock, really, and the barbecue. I know one night we all packed up and went over to a barbecue joint, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and just kind of commandeered the place and set up, and of course the folks loved it, and we had a ball. So I did definitely did my time on the north side, as they say.
I mean, is it fair to say that basically, as it got later, obviously people would be able to smuggle alcohol into the clubs, and people could be drinking even though it was technically a dry town?
Oh yeah. It was what they used to call brown bagging, BYO.
Yeah, they still call it that. That hasn't changed. Yeah, brown bagging.
Yeah, or brown bagging or BYOB.
BYOB.
And sure, oh yeah, that was standard fare. And later on in the '60s, actually more in the '70s, there was one. Well, they had, I think by then they had passed liquor by the drink, so most of the places in town had to close it too. But there was one place on the north side called the International Cafe, and I'm sure there must have been a little bit of a payoff somewhere along the line, because the authorities looked the other way. And the International, that's kind of where the Gap Band really got a foothold and got started In fact, it was even before Robert Lynn, the bass player, the youngest brother, was even old enough to go hang out.
Wow.
And the Gap Band used to play over there. And that place was, it was till the last dog died. I don't think he ever closed. And,
dude, that band, I mean, you're talking about before they were the Gap Band, but that whole group was rock. That whole group was playing R&B and stuff.
They were calling themselves the Gap Band, but it was Ronnie was about the only one that when I first went over there. And then Charlie came along not long after that, but the Gap Band was completely. They had guitars, white guitars named Tuck Andrus before Odell Stokes came into the band, and they had a bass player, Brian Phelps, I believe. His nickname was Face. He was a real tall, thin guy, and everybody called him Face. He was the bass player. And so then finally Robert got old enough, and he took over the bass duties. But you could go over there. I mean, everybody would play their regular gigs till 2, and just make a beeline for it over there. And of course, they had the best. You could get fried chicken. They had the best fried chicken and French fries ever.
Oh, man.
And if your brown bag ran empty, what was that? I forget the guy's name that ran it, and he had some old Pontiac or something just outside the back. You always went in and out the back door.
Right.
And he had some, and you parked back there and everything. And he had some old car up on blocks. And if you ran low, he'd go out there and raise the trunk on that old car and sell you a half pint for $3.
Unbelievable!
So,
wow.
That was. Go ahead.
No, my gut tells me. I mean, jazz. Even I don't like genre labeling of music, but jazz was still considered popular music at that time. And I'm just wondering if Karstein had a. If you played a Stone Jazz gig every once in a while in Tulsa.
Not really. I've never considered myself a jazz drummer. I have played at jazz on a few occasions, but
well, let me ask you something. Okay, so you're not a bebopper, but I'm saying, how did you use? Who were some of the guys that you did like, that you listened to, that were playing traps in the jazz setting, and how did you inflect that into your playing of country blues?
Well, before I actually got old enough to start playing in bands around town, on a real steady kind of basis, I listened to a lot of the early jazz, real heavy jazz drummers like Krupa and Rich and Art Blakey and Max Roach and and all those guys. And I was just kind of in awe. I mean, that was, if you equate drumming to mathematics, what I did was 2 and 2 = 4, and they were in advanced, trigonometry and physics. I mean, that was so far. There was one, the lead jazz guy in Tulsa during the real early days, the late 50s and 60s, is when I really started getting into it. And Sonny Gray, and he had his own club, and he had a drummer that was Tulsa's answer to Joe Morello, and we'd go out there, and I'd listen to him, and he'd do things. It was just like, it'd be like watching the Ed Sullivan Show and some guy pulling rabbits out of a hat.
Right. He had eight arms. Yeah. No, he was flying all over the place.
He was so advanced a drummer beyond anything I did. Now, for my early influence was Leon's drummer, Chuck Blackwell, who unfortunately we just lost about 3, maybe 4 months ago.
Oh, rest in peace, Chuck, man. I didn't know he just left us.
Yeah, we lost Chuck. And,
So I want to ask you something. This is so important. So was he your peer, or was he already a little bit ahead of you? And then please continue on why he had.
He was very much ahead of me.
Uh-huh.
I remember the first night I heard him. Well, he was playing with Leon. You know, he was considered Leon's drummer for forever. And the first night I ever went out to hear him, in fact, well, of course, I've had to quit playing now, but I still, if I was still playing, I still set up my drums and tuned them in line with what Chuck had. That first night I went out to see him, that was probably about 1959 or 1960 was the first time I ever heard he and Leon play. And Chuck was more of a mentor to me, you know, and an inspiration, and of course a lifelong friend. But he was the first guy, because they played Sonny Gray's Butch. They played just straight ahead jazz, more, not quite so much bebop, but more in a Dave Brubeck or something like that. You know, very.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, because Morello was doing the 5/4 time. So was it kind of post bop? Would you say, or I mean, was it free? Was it free jazz?
Yeah. No, it was between. They were somewhere between the latter stages of bebop and you know, free jazz was still way into the future. You know, they were just playing. They'd play the standards, you know, in a real, you know, jazz idiom, you know, in a real jazz way. But now Leon and Chuck played hits of the day and some standards and blues and whatever, but they would lean into in kind of a jazz direction at times, you know, and so of course, you know, I mean, later on, you know, when Leon became quote Leon unquote, right. You know, then they started blowing the roof off, you know. So, but in the early days, they played. I don't know.
This is important. No, Jimmy, what you're doing. This is so. You just said something. You said they leaned in a jazz direction. Can you go deeper on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, they would play, you know, not so much with a heavy 2/4 backbeat.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
mm-hmm.
Not so much a Little Richard. You know,
exactly.
More of a maybe. I don't know. It's been so many years ago.
Well, let me ask you quite. Let me. It's not about naming people. I'm curious about the technique that Chuck was using, especially with the bass drum. He wasn't pounding it on 2 and 4. He feathered the bass drum and things like. What kind of techniques was he using?
Yeah. He was. He would play steady time, but he would throw every now and then in, you know, what a drummer term called independence, you know. He would break it up a little bit, you know, whereas if you were playing Little Richard, you just played, you know, straight ahead. But, you know, they didn't play, you know, nose to the grindstone type of, you know, when they stepped on the gas a little bit, you know. It was always, of course, when I heard them, they were playing in a place called Griff's Supper Club, and it was you know, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, you know, white tablecloths, you know, kind of a deal. So that's, that's where I first heard them. Now they'd go out and play the Playmore Ballroom and places like that. Of course, I only got a chance to go hear them. I didn't hear them a lot. I didn't really hear. It wasn't until we all wound up in California when I really,
Right. I mean, you guys were all just sort of passing each other on the fly, and like, you kind of did your own thing. Before we leave Tulsa, did you play in North Tulsa? Did you get a chance to play like just what was very vogue at that time? I know was just B3 and drums. A guy might be kicking pedals and then be a drummer. Did you play in any duo settings? And more specifically, how did you learn to feel and play a good feeling shuffle?
Listening to Chuck and just every rhythm and blues record that had a shuffle on it, and then, once I got to California, there was other drummers and a shuffle is a shuffle, but there's a million interpretations of that. And in fact, the April issue's already out. I've got a friend that I met who lives over in Oklahoma City that does articles for Modern Drummer occasionally. In fact, he did one on Chuck, David Teagarden, and I about 2 years ago. And he has just done an article. Well, it's in the March issue, which is already off the stands. Modern Drummer's always way ahead, and in a time frame as far as their release. But last month, a friend of mine, Cleve Warren, over in Oklahoma City, a great drummer, has been around. He's as old as we are, and knows everybody. And he wrote an article for Modern Drummer on a guy named George Raines, Sugar George, who's been with Jimmy Vaughn now for years, and was played from everybody from Boz Skaggs to the list as long as your arm. And everybody always, I said, George has got the best shuffle of anybody going. In fact, if Jimmy Vaughn ever comes through your area anytime soon, go see him, and I'm sure it'll be George playing drums, and tell him I said hello, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you hear him play, because he was originally out of Fort Worth, and he grew up on a lot of blues, and Jimmy Reed and things like that, and so my shuffle is just a conglomeration of, the million other drummers I've heard do it. And then I just kind of, put my own spin to it, which is really kind of subtle. I mean, it's kind of hard. Sometimes, I could tell one drummer from another, It's just all, and it's a lot of it. The way your shuffle might come out has to do with the rest of the band. The bass player and the rhythm guitar player and the piano player. The rest of the rhythm section, how their interpretation, might make your shuffle sound different on Wednesday night, and then you go play with some of the other guys on Friday night, and it might sound a little different to somebody else's ears. To me, it always would feel, it might feel the same, but it might come out sounding different, if you're just sitting up front listening. So it's a pretty fine, fine line there, from one shuffle to the next.
I'm just curious about, did you have... when you got out to Southern California, it looks to me that the Wrecking Crew was well on its way. How did you get your break into the studio scene?
I was always kind of what you'd call a B squad in the studio scene out in California.
No, that's still pretty good. I mean, a B team in SoCal is you're doing okay. You're getting gigs.
Well, I did a lot of demo work. There was one period of time when Leon was dating Jackie DeShannon, and her best girlfriend, Sharon Shealy, they'd get together and write songs. And they knew well, of course, when Leon had met through Snuff Garrett, who was a record producer at a record company called Liberty Records.
Absolutely.
And their publishing company this is in the days of independent record companies, and when people actually cut demo records. And their publishing company, Metric Music, run by a guy named Dick Glasper. And there was a period of time there. I don't know how long it went on for. I don't know if time gets so distorted after so many years, but it seemed like it went on for several months anyway. Dick Glasser would call up Leon and say, I've got 3 songs be down at the studio. There was a studio at Sunset and La Brea up above a restaurant. And we'd go up there, on a Monday or Tuesday, and we'd always do at least 2, maybe 3, sometimes 4 tunes. And we'd go in on a Monday or Tuesday, and we'd do it. And he said, okay, be back here Thursday. I'll have some more. And the lineup was just unbelievable. Sometimes Randy Newman was playing piano if Leon couldn't make it. Sometimes David Gates, Glenn Campbell, or James Burton on guitar. I played drums, and Carl Radel was the bass player. And either Jackie would sing or Darlene Love from the Blossoms, from the Phil Spector world, would sing. And it was just, and we cut a lot of demos. And I played here and there and around. The only thing that I ever played that came close to being a hit was and it was a sub call from Jimmy Lee Kellner, and it was Cheech and Chong's Basketball Jones. If you've ever heard that. And
wait, hold on. He's like, I'll give you. He's like, I want you to. I can't make this. You got to make it.
Yeah, oh yeah, and it was an all-star cast. Klaus Vorman played bass. I think Carole King was playing piano. Who else?
So was it a movie soundtrack or just some sort of made for TV thing?
No, it was just a song they had written for an LP they put out. And I don't know if it ever came out in one of their movies or not.
What was the name? And just tell me the name. Tell me the name of it one more time.
Basketball Jones.
Basketball Jones, and there's Karstein filling in for Jimmy Lee Kellner. I want to be clear though.
Yeah.
I mean, Leon, Radel, Blackwell, Karstein. What was the sequential order? How did you guys just one day get together and all drive out together to save money? I mean, how did you get out there? Who got out there first?
Oh no. Leon and Chuck were out there the first time I went out. Now, it was back in those days, a year or two difference in age made quite a bit of difference, because when I was, still a junior and senior in high school, Leon and Chuck and J.J. Cale, Johnny Cale in those days, and some other, they were the ones that really, made the mark. Now, Jimmy Lee's from Tulsa, but nobody knew him until years later, until we met him out in California.
Well, he was a baseball fanatic. He was just playing ball,
Well, yeah, but see, uh, he and his family, they moved to Pasadena when he was 13 years old.
Right.
So it wasn't until Gary Lewis and the Playboys came along that we all met Keltner. And Keltner was, how that happened was Keltner was working in a music store, and Gary Lewis came in there. Initially Gary played drums, and he came in there, I guess, looking for drums or sticks or whatever, and Keltner was working there, and they met. And then when Gary decided to go out front and start playing guitar, they hired Keltner. Well, Gary was produced by Snuff Garrett and arranged by Leon. So Leon meets Keltner, and they get to chewing the fat, and that's when everybody found out that Keltner was from Tulsa. See, Keltner left Tulsa when he was 13 years old, so that was even, Chuck and Leon and Cale and some of those guys. Now, Leon, everybody thinks he was the elder statesman of the whole Tulsa crew. It's just because he looked like it, with his white hair and everything. But actually, Chuck was older than Leon, and Cale was older than both of them. And they had all been out to California. See, I was still in school, and they had graduated from school, and they had already made a run to California and back, some of them a couple of times. And when I graduated in 1961 and went out to California 2 weeks later, and Chuck and Leon were already out there. So it was a gradual,
But I want to be clear about the chronology here. How old were you when you actually moved to Los Angeles?
17.
So the reality is that Jimmy Lee was already there. He just was younger than you, and you didn't discover him till Gary Lewis connected with him.
Yeah, he was already there, but he wasn't younger than I. Keltner's, I don't know, I think he's 77 now, something like that.
Because he moved there when he was 13, and you...
His family moved out there when he was 13 years old. They moved out, I'm not sure exactly what year Keltner was born, but at 13, he was still in school. So, they went out, he moved out there in the early 50s. And the rest of the guys from around here, they probably didn't start going out to California until about 58, maybe 59, something like that.
James Lee Keltner was born in April 1942.
42, there you go. Okay, well, and Keltner's only 1 year older than I am. I was thinking he was a couple of years older.
But he was working, and by the way, the music store in Pasadena, Barium Grossman, right? That's where he was working, at that music store teaching.
I guess I'll take your word on that. He just told me. He just never told me the name of the place, so that's the first time.
Yeah, he was teaching snare drum. David Lindley was teaching banjo, and a cat named Gary Foster was teaching, I think, clarinet. And so that's where Jerry Lewis came in. Jerry Lewis came in and discovered Keltner at that point.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And
so I want to get back to Karstein. It's such a great honor to hang with you. I mean, did any of these demos get radio play? I mean, and did any of them lead to albums with Jackie DeShannon? Because really, on the All Music Guide, it's saying that your career, you played percussion with Delaney and Bonnie in '69. It says the first time you played drums was a guy named Mark Benno, self-titled album 1970. But when you were cutting these demos, did any of these make it to record?
That I couldn't tell you. I've always said I would give anything to hear some of those tapes again.
Right.
I have no idea now what songs we cut, and I know they didn't. I don't think any of them ever came out as a Jackie DeShannon record or Darling Love record or whatever. They were just demos, and Dick Glasser would take them back to Metric Music at Liberty and try and place them with stars. I don't know, maybe Bobby V might have cut one, or something like that. Somebody that was already an established star. And so,
could you talk to the audience about? This is fascinating to me. When you did get into the studio, could you talk about a producer that you worked with who would mic, who would have the musicians come in the room and play, and then determine if this guitar needed a little bit more, or this leakage was okay, and how their miking techniques, because it's not really a digital analog thing, as I've come to figure out about why I like certain pocket of music. It's really the miking, how they mic the room. Can you talk about a seminal studio album early on, and a producer that you had, and the way they mic'd the room to make it sound and feel so good? Any of those Cale albums, they feel good because they were mic'd well.
Yeah, that was just all. Nowadays, a lot of drummers carry around their own mics, and
no, every part of the kit is mic'd. Every part of it, and that was not what was going on before when you were in there.
No. In the old days, they might put a mic on the bass drum and an overhead.
That's
maybe
right.
A mic on the snare. The days of and mic placement and all that real technical side of recording really was just starting to blossom. By that time, I was pretty much out of California. Although I considered California headquarters for 30 years, I was out there all during the 60s. I spent all the 60s, and then I didn't come back. I came back home about 73, the middle of 73 or something. I was in a musical situation, and I thought, well, the only way I'm going to get out of this, because I knew it wasn't going to get off the ground, and I had spent over a year with it, and I thought, well, you know what, I think I'll go back home. I came from a very kind of a small family. I was an only child of an only child, and my mother and I pretty much lived, and I was, growing up and going to school, we lived with my grandparents, and and my grandparents were starting to get up in age, and so I just pulled up stakes in the early 70s and came home. And that's when I started going to the International Cafe and some of that fried chicken and jamming all night.
Oh, wow.
And the 70s were really the high water mark for music for me and my generation around Tulsa, because that's when Leon moved his Shelter Records to Tulsa and took up residents back here again, and there were a couple of clubs in town. It was just 7 nights a week, and Leon was bringing people like Dylan and George Harrison and Bonnie Raitt had come through town, and you never knew. Some nights you might be at the Nine of Cups and Eric Clapton would show up, and it was just 7 nights a week solid. So I came back about the middle of 73 or something, and wound up spending about a year. I spent that Christmas and spent the next year, I guess would have been 74, and at Christmas I told my grandparents, I said, well, it's really been nice being here, and seeing you all this time, but I've got to get back to California and get back to work. Well, the 5th of January, my grandmother passed away. So I couldn't really go off and leave my granddad. I just couldn't do it. And so it turned into kind of a Sanford and Son deal there. And but unfortunately, he only lived for another year. And there I was with their house, and they had been married for 40 years, and I had to do something. He left the house to my mother-in-law. Now she had moved on. Now once I left home, she moved out on her own, and he left the house to she and I. But she only lived for another year, so then I had to deal with all of her stuff. So I wound up being, and the story goes on and on. I didn't really get out of Tulsa until about 78 and got out to California. My granddad's brother had helped me out with, he was the executor of my granddad's business and on and on and on. And I just got back out to California, and my aunt called, and she said, your uncle's got lung cancer. And I jumped back, in my van and came back to Tulsa and was back here again for about another year or so. So I wound up being here in Tulsa for most of the 70s. And it wasn't until the 80s that I got back to California. Well, by the time I got back out to California full time in the 80s, I mean, things had, all the old Tulsa gang had moved on. There was hardly anybody. The only person that was Cale. He moved back out to, he'd been living in Nashville all during the 70s, and he moved back to California in the 80s. But, Leon had left town, and all the other, Carl Radel was gone by then. And
had he passed? Had Carl already passed already, or had he moved back to Tulsa?
Yeah. Carl, I forget. Well, he came to Tulsa after his tenure with Clapton came to an end. He'd made a lot of money, and he'd come to Tulsa and built a house, and then he passed away sometime in the 70s. I don't know. I forget.
Jimmy, I want to ask you a question. Can you explain? You can be as modest as you want, but you were, as they say, singing for your supper in California, and you were making a decent living, and the cost of living wasn't nearly as what it is today. Explain the exodus back to Tulsa from the point of view of Leon. I mean, was it stuff that it was like, well, we're sick and tired of this sort of slick, produced LA scene? Because I mean, you were making good bread there. I mean, was it something that you said that there was sort of something you were working on for a year. You knew it wasn't going to pan out, but at the same time, I mean, those cats all moved back. Leon and those guys. I mean, he started Shelter Records, and and all those guys like Willis Allen Ramsey, such a decorated. All these great cats were on that label. But why did you leave Southern California if you were already established in the scene there?
Well, that's what I say. I got into a musical situation there. Around 1970, 71, 72, and I just hung and I hung and I hung, and I could tell that it wasn't really ever going to fly. So I thought, well, the best way for me to get out of this, and I hadn't been back to Tulsa for any length of time, really, so I just pulled up stakes and drove back to Tulsa and just kind of got swept up in, into everything that was going on. There was more going on here at that time, it seemed to me like, than there was in California, because the old gang, if you want to put it that way, now actually, see, everybody wasn't really making all that much money. Leon made a lot of money. Cale never made any money back in those days. He never started making any money until the 70s, 71, when his first album came out. And, and if it hadn't been for Clapton doing After Midnight, and Leonard Skinner doing Call Me the Breeze, he might still, have been a side man.
So you're telling me, though, hold on. So Leon and Cale, those guys split before you left, and then you were like, and you kind of knew that there would be work for you if you did go back to Tulsa.
No, no, I didn't know that. I just knew it was time to move on. I
Mm-hmm.
had been in that one situation for over a year, and when I came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to ever fly, I was never going to make anything because I mean, we'd just go months at a time and not play, and so I just it was more I've just got to get out of this situation. I think I'll run home for a little bit. I had no idea I was going to wind up being in Tulsa for the greater part of the 70s. That was I had that was the last thing on my I was thinking about when I left LA. I thought I'll just go back, see the folks. It was about I guess it was about the middle of '73, and I thought, how time flies, and the next thing Christmas starts rolling around. So I thought, well, I'll stay for Christmas. And then by then, Leon had come back and they had got that church studio established, and like I say, all that other stuff was going on, and the jams at the International Academy. There was just a lot more going on here at that time for me than there was in California, because the old gang had split up, and everybody that had been out there had left. In fact, everybody had left. I know, Cale was in Nashville. I mean, he went from California back here to Tulsa for a brief period of time, and then when he got his deal with Shelter in that first album, the producer Snuff Garrett sent him to Audie Ashworth in Nashville, and that's when they put together Naturally. And he stayed in Nashville for all of the 70s. I spent some time down there, from time to time. He'd go to work or go on tour or something, and I'd leave Tulsa, and I'd go to Tennessee, and go on the road with him, and maybe do some recording with him down there. And
well, you did quite a bit. I mean, we're talking to a legendary drummer, Jimmy Karstein, one of the humblest cats in the world. I'm going to put this tune in for you, see if you can recognize it, and then we'll come back and break it down, okay?
Okay.
Listen to me, mother, I've been busted for obscenity. You got to listen to me, mother, get my belly get free. Yes, you do. Listen to me, mother, listen all around. Listen to me, mother, hell, that duty down. Put you down on Main Street, who's my lover when I'm coming down. Listen to me, mother, Jesus was an outlaw too. Yes, he was. Yeah, listen to me, mother, don't believe the things they're telling you. No, don't. Listen to me, mother, what I say. Listen to me, mother, tell you I'm going insane, but I just come out of junk and need a victim to the priest for my brain. Yes, I do. Hold around with gone crucifixion had begun to set in. Yeah, yeah. Devil's a policeman with a hammer screaming about my sin. Yes, yeah. You got to help me. Without you, I'll be lost. Everybody's screaming 'cause I'm too damn weak to bear this cross. Yeah. Listen to me, mother. The hell with your morality. Yeah, yeah. You got to listen to me, mother. Suicide if I ain't free. Yeah, yeah. Listen to me, mother. Just can't wait. Listen to me, mother. Time is running
music on the Jake Feinberg Show, brought to you by the Circle Tree Ranch, the Stereo Hospital, Craig Pretzinger of Allstate Insurance, and the Jewish Community Center of Southern Arizona, and we thank them for their support. All right, Mr. Karstein, what do you got for us there?
Well, boy, I sure do like that drummer shuffle.
Oh, that's Jimmy Karstein is cooking the groove on that, man. That's you on drums.
Oh, I didn't recognize.
Well, of course you didn't, because you're so humble. You probably didn't even recognize half the sessions you've been on. This was actually uploaded by a cat that arranged this tune. Jesus Was an Outlaw too, 1970 or 71. Bobby Jameson, Jesse Ed Davis on lead guitar, Bob Glaub on bass, Jimmy Karstein on drums.
And who's the artist again?
Bobby Jameson.
Bobby Jameson.
It was recorded around 70 or 71. Jesse Ed was on lead guitar, Bob Glaub on bass. Is that you recognize that name? And Randy Newman on piano.
Oh my!
This could have been one of those demos. This could have been one of those demos that you never heard.
I doubt it, because those demos that I was talking about was before Jesse Ed came along.
Okay, so can you talk about how because there were cats that were blown away. They'd walk into the Whiskey A Go-Go, and there's Taj Mahal playing with Jesse Ed Davis, this huge Comanche Indian. Do you remember when you first got hip to Jesse Ed?
More or less. I can't remember the exact night, but he just he showed up at Leon. Once he really started making money as with the wrecking crew, etc. And bought a house. It was called Sky Hill. Everybody just called it Sky. It was on the street was Sky Hill, so everybody just called the house Sky Hill. And it was just, the door was never locked. And people, you liable to drift in there, and there's Glenn Gamble,
right.
And that kind of a thing. Glenn and Leon were pretty good buddies in those days. And name it, it could. And it was just that during that period, kind of the mid-'60s, that, all of a sudden, here's this, guy, and he's from Oklahoma City. And he would have been, if I had to make a guess of the guitar player on that. Now, let me write that down. What's that artist's name again?
Well, first of all, I'm going to, if you had an email, I'd send you the link on YouTube. The guy who published it is the same guy who performed this guy, Bobby Jameson. All right, so he performed it and recorded it. It says 70-71. And the name of the tune is Jesus Was an Outlaw too. Randy Newman, piano. Jesse Ed on lead guitar. Bob Glaub on bass. Jimmy Karstein on drums. And you like that shuffle, right?
Well, I wouldn't. That's what I say.
It sounds great, man. I'm telling you, man.
I didn't even recognize myself, but I'll have to ask. I've recently. We've kind of found. We kind of kept in touch over the years. Maybe, I might go 10 years or something and not talk to him. But here lately, in the last couple of years, Bob Glaub and I have been keeping in touch. And in fact, he's worked on and off with Jackson Brown for years. And they came through town, I guess it was last year, maybe a year before now, I forget. Anyway, and so Bob and I have been kind of keeping in touch, so I'm going to have to ask him about that.
What's really amazing, Karstein, is that what's so funny about the 6 Degrees of Separation is I was just in L.A. doing video work, a Facebook live video with a cat you might or might not know, a guy named Mike Finnegan, who is a great singer and organ player. And
yeah,
I mean, it's
I've
just like,
never.
yeah, he was doing work he worked with Ron Wood, actually. So that you might have known that. But the point is, I'm in there we did an hour long live video, and Finnegan's sitting at his piano and he's playing, and he's singing his butt off. He's singing Ray Charles tunes and just ridiculous soul tunes, White Cat with a Black Soul. And who chimes in with a comment but Bob Glaub saying Mike Finnegan is a national treasure? And I was like, Bob Glaub, who is that cat? And it's just really funny that happened like a week ago. And now you're saying
Yeah.
you've been connecting with Glaub again. Yeah, man, I'm just letting you know that this track is on YouTube, and Bobby Jameson, who performed this tune and was the one singing it, listed the credits. So it's spot on, man. I mean,
Well, I certainly didn't. Of course, what year did you say?
I mean, it was
1970?
recorded between 70 and 71, but you were still in L.A. at that point, But I mean, listen,
Yeah,
I've done this
yeah.
this name that tune thing. It befuddles the best of them. I mean, I've gotten Keltner, everybody, and I play these random tunes, but I think there's just a lot more to your discography than's currently listed. Can you just talk about the calling that you had to play the music? Some people would say today, and there's plenty of beautiful cats that are playing great music, but a lot of people, younger, my generation and younger, they're getting into music now a lot of ways because of fame and fortune, what they see on TV, and you guys were more auditory learners. You didn't even know some cats if they were black or white. It didn't really matter. The music had to feel good.
Right.
And so therefore it was such an insatiable desire. You had this calling to get in. Can you talk about how intense that calling was for you to play the music that made you feel so good?
My earliest recollections are preschool. There's always been a heavy magnetic attraction for me to the music, and I remember some kid had one of those little plastic, well, they're all plastic, but some little disc before I even was in school, and it was the name of the song was Timbuktu, Kalamazoo, and Back. It was kind of a train song, and I remember I just fell in love with it, and he and I'd sit around and listen to it, I don't know, 15 times in a row, until our parents had hollered at us, enough. I've always had the attraction to the music, and but the difference, I think, well, for me anyway, I'll just speak for myself. When I went to California, nowadays, it seemed like anybody that starts playing music, regardless of at what age, they approach it as a career. Okay,
Right.
This is my career,
Right.
and I never thought of it in those terms. I just liked the music and wanted to play it. And when I got out of high school, Leon and Chuck and those guys are already out there, and I knew there was a lot more going on out there than there was in Tulsa. It was just the lure of the music. I didn't think about going out there trying to, quote, make money. I didn't think in terms of career or, quote, making it, unquote. I just went where the action is because I love the music. And I know the first night I got to California, the guy that I stayed with said, well, you probably want to go hear Leon and Chuck tonight, don't you? And I said, yeah. And they were working. I was staying with this guy who was staying in an apartment in Hollywood, and they were playing in Downey and Norwalk, which was about 15 miles, 20 miles, maybe not quite that far, down the freeway. and Chuck was working with a band on one side of the street in Norwalk, and Leon was working on the other side of the street in Downey. And you know, I mean, yeah, I just went from there. I didn't think about my career. You know, that was the last thought. That was as far from, you know, my mind, and it never did until, you know, later years. You know, I was you know, looking for a musical home, which I actually more or less found with Cale. The only thing about Cale was he's, you know, he was the least aggressive guy that's ever been in the music business. and you know, he could have, you know, he made his money off of his songwriting, basically.
Sure.
Of course, he made money off of these records, but really, and of course, he claims he never made a dime touring. He just did that to promote his records. And so I did everything that you can do in the music business practically, except make money. You know, that's the only one that I never really, you know, I mean, Cale paid me pretty good, you know, when we played. I got a fair wage. You know, there was never one time when he'd say, well, how much do you want? You know, he'd say, okay, we're going on tour, and I'm going to pay you this. And I'm fine, let's go. When do we leave? You know, I never thought really in terms of career. I just always wanted to have a musical home, so to speak. And a couple of times I thought I had found it, and it didn't work out. And that's what I say. That's then, you know, I wound up working with Cale for some 35 years. But he, you know, Cale would work. He might tour for a while, for a year or so, on and off. Of course, he never went out for more than, and one of his latter day, almost next to the last tour, we went out and was gone for about almost 30 days. But, you know, I mean, he'd never leave home for more than 10 days at a time, and you didn't play every night on that. And and then he'd tour for a while, and then he might not. There was 3 times between his first album and the latter days there when he wouldn't tour for 6 years. And sometimes during the 80s, he might call me in. He'd call me in for, you know, recording, but he wouldn't tour. And that's really, you know, where the only time I made any steady money with him was when he was touring. When we record, he'd pay me for the sessions. But, you know, it was just not, nowadays, you know, you take a kid 15 years old and he's thinking of his, quote, career, unquote, you know, and he's approaching it that way. In those days, we all just went to California because that's where the action was, you know, and we played out Tulsa. You know, we played everything there was to play around here, and played every place there was to play around here, and there was just so much more going on in California. So that's how, you know.
Yeah. No. Well, we're talking to international drummer Jimmy Karstein, again, downplaying his recognition. He already didn't even realize he was playing on this Jameson track. We got another tune here. I want to put this in, see if you can figure this one out, okay?
Okay.
get back on your feet again. Here they all come, they say that you're long lost friend. It's mighty strange, but without a doubt, nobody loves you. Nobody wants you. Nobody loves what you're
All right, my man, what do you got for us?
Well, I'll give a stab in the dark and say it was Clapton.
Right, you want to? That's right, and that's you playing drums. And you remember what album you played with him on?
Well, it could only be the Rainbow Concert.
You got it, man. And
Yeah.
1973, and Jimmy Karstein on drums, Jim Capaldi, Rick Gretsch, Steve Winwood, Ron Wood, Pete Townsend, Eric Clapton. How did you get the nod for that? And because I thought Jimmy Gordon was playing with him.
No, Jimmy Gordon was Derek and the Dominoes.
That's right.
And that came about me just being at the right place at the right time. I was actually working. Well, I was in London recording with Joe Cocker. You know, I did a couple of different stints with Joe, and I had been in London. I was over there for 3 or 4 months during this, and the phone rang one day, and it was Jerry Allison. Everybody called him J.I. And Jivin' Ivan, J.I. Allison, and he was the Peggy Sue drummer. He was the original Buddy Holly drummer, and was one of the only Crickets that was. He and Joe B. Malden, the bass player, were the only 2 Crickets that were there, you know, the whole time. And but it was, what year did you say that was?
It says 73. Yeah, that was in London, recorded live in London at the Rainbow Theater.
At the Rainbow, right. And I was laid up one afternoon in the Cumberland Hotel. The phone rang. It was J.I. And he said, "Well, Karstein, you old dog, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm over here. You know, I've been over here working with Cocker." And that was about, you know, we'd record, and then we'd have, you know, maybe go a couple of weeks and not do anything. And was kind of in one of those lulls. And J.I. said, well, he said, "Listen," he said, "I'm over here with Joe B. and Sonny Curtis." You know, of course, that was years after Buddy. And because the Crickets were still big in England. And he said, "I'm over here with Sonny Curtis, the guitar player, and Joe B. Malden, the bass player." And he said, "We're doing Crickets." He said, "We're doing cabaret," which is basically, you know, that was kind of nightclub work. And they were booked a lot, you know. And he said, "I got a call." Actually, Pete Townsend was the one that did all the legwork on that. And he said, to play this thing with Clapton. He said, well, I'm over here with the Crickets doing this cabaret, and I don't have the time to devote to it. He said, because they're going to rehearse every night and do the gig. And he said, I just can't do it. He said, "Are you interested?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so. Sure, why not?" You know, Clapton's had more careers than anybody in show business.
That's right.
And it was one of his comebacks. And so Jay and I, we talked for a little bit, and I hung up, and 10 minutes later the phone rang, and it was Pete Townsend. And he said, "You don't do this?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sure, why not?" And he said, well, I'll come by. He said, we're going to start rehearsals tomorrow night. And he came by in some stretch limo and picked me up, and we drove out to Ron Wood's house, and we rehearsed 8 nights straight in a row at Ron Wood's house with that full lineup.
Wow.
And
Wow.
on the 9th night, we went to, it was like a school auditorium kind of thing, you know, at night after school was out, where they could set up a big PA and we could all get on a big stage, you know, well, a big stage, you know, as a school, it was pretty good size. And their auditorium, more or less, where they could actually set everything up and mic it, and, you know, and we could go full out, because when we rehearsed the first 8 nights, we were just in kind of a den, kind of a room at Ron Wood's house. And then on the 10th day, they took all the equipment down, and we went down that afternoon, set up sound check, played the gig, and that was it, you know. And as far as I know, at the last minute, Clapton decided that he wanted Capaldi to play drums too. Jim had just been singing some background parts and playing tambourines and whatnot, and of course Rebop was playing congas. And but at the last minute, on that 8th night or 9th night, I guess, when we rehearsed at that school auditorium, he said, he said, Capaldi, you play drums too. Let's have 2 drummers on this. And Glenn Johns leaned over to me at some point in time that night, or the sound check the next afternoon. He said, well, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, I'm going to record both sets. He said, but I'm only going to mix one.
I love it.
And he said, that's just too much. He said, I'm just not going to mess with mixing 2 sets of drums. And so, as you know, to my knowledge, that's me, not Jim.
Well, no, I mean, but also, I mean, what went out to the crowd that night was double drums, but what got recorded was just Karstein, right?
Right. That's what came out on the recording.
Right.
He recorded both sets, but he said, I'm only going to mix one set, you know, to the master.
Well, I was going to ask you, just to be clear, you were out there because you were doing studio work with Cocker. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you were in a record, like you had a house out there that you stayed at, and you got a call from Townsend, and he's like, would you be interested in doing this cabaret thing? Where were you? Did you have a house out there?
No, I was staying in a hotel. I had done a tour with Cocker, and at the end of the tour, they said, let's all go back to London and cut an album on Joe. And so everybody said, okay, let's go. So, well, you know, half of the guys lived there, you know, so that was no big deal for them. But for me and the 3 gals that were the background singer, Viola Wills and I forget.
Virginia Ayers and Beverly Gardner.
There you go. You remember this stuff?
No, it's just it's called YouTube. You just queue up I have this Joe Cocker. Didn't you know you got to cry sometime? That's the album, 1972, and those are the 3 singers on it: Jim Price and Bobby Keys, Jim Horn, Felix Falcon, Karstein, Hubbard, Spenner, Cocker.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you were there in a hotel. You were just sort of camping out, making an album, and Townsend called you.
Yeah.
It
was, you know, like I say, we had tracked and worked and overdubbed and everything, and you know, there'd be a lull, and you know, and they'd say, okay, or Joe may want to take a week off or something. I don't remember now exactly how it was,
right?
But I know I was still staying at the myself and the girls were at the Cumberland Hotel, and I don't know how J.I. knew I was there. He knew I was there, and you know, I've never asked him how he, you know, Now that you mentioned it, I don't have a clue. It's just the phone rang one day, and
I wouldn't be
no,
surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if Leon had something to do with it, but I could be wrong. But Karstein, as we wrap up, this is just set one, but as we wrap it up, I wanted you to talk about seeing Jim Keltner playing jazz with Albert Stinson. That cat in the 60s was playing, he was a jazz snob by his own account. All he wanted to be was Philly Joe Jones. And can you talk about what that was like? I mean, I know you're not a jazz, you're not a bebop, or you're not, that kind of, but I mean, I know you discovered Keltner at with Jerry Lewis, but really his bag was jazz. Can you talk about what that was like to see him play in that way?
Well, just we all met Jim and hung out, and I know, other than what I would hear him play on records, now those Gary Lewis records.
Gary Lewis, I'm sorry, Gary.
I don't know about the very first recordings, but I know later on that's Hal Blaine playing drums on that. That's probably Hal Blaine playing on all those Gary Lewis records. In fact, I tell people that was one of the best jobs I ever had. We'd be out on the road with Gary, and they'd say, "Okay, Tuesday, be down at RCA. We're going to record." And be down there at 11 o'clock or whatever, 10 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock or whatever, and walked in, and there was a receptionist and her desk and everything, and they had the 1099s or W4s in those days or whatever it was, and I just kind of was tagging along, and they said, "No, fill one out, So I signed my filled out my W4 and signed my name to it and went in, and they'd already told me that Hal was actually going to play, so I didn't have to worry about drums or anything. And I always tell everybody that was one of the best, jobs I ever had. I got paid to pull up a chair and sit there and watch Hal get a free lesson watching Hal Blaine cut records, But now I never really heard Jimmy play much around L.A. because I was always busy doing this and that and the other. Now that name that you mentioned, Albert Stinson, was that it?
Yeah, the bass player.
I remember that name, but the only two times that I really remember hearing Jimmy play and hearing him play full-out jazz was the one time in the 60s. I guess late 60s. I don't remember.
Absolutely. No, you're spot on. You're spot on.
Well, he was playing with Gabor Szabo, and I was working with just a little club band, a guy out of Texas called Charlie Carey, and we went up and that's back in the days when you could get a job at a place for a week or two, and we were up there, and Jimmy was playing with Gabor, and we went one night down to hear him play hear that, and then
was it Shelley's Manhole? Was that at Shelley's?
No, this was in San Francisco.
You have any idea? You have any idea what club it was, or was it at the Both And or the workshop?
No, I can't remember.
So how did you wind up in San Francisco? Why were you up in? That's where the gigs were with this cat Carey.
Yeah, I was working with Charlie Carey,
and
he got a job, working up on Broadway or whatever they call it, that strip where all the clubs are up there, and North Broad, I think they call it, or whatever. And I don't know, we went after we got off work, or it was a night off or something, because I think we worked up there for at least 2 weeks. Maybe we might have been booking that club for a month, And at some point in time, Jim was playing with Gabor, so we went and I heard him play then. And then later on, it was around 1970, Jimmy played at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach with a group called the Afro Blues Quintet.
Oh, my. And I'll tell you, that is where my original connection came with Keltner, because the bass player in the Afro Blues Quintet was a guy named Henry Franklin, and he was one of my first guests, and I've stayed with the skipper, and he's been a huge beacon of light for me. And when he told me that Keltner was in that group, I lost my mind. You're telling me they played at the Lighthouse?
Yeah, they were playing. Howard runs his Lighthouse.
Oh, I did the last interview with Howard, man. Rest in peace. What a badass he was.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know him personally, but I used to go there all the time. All the time. I went there many times.
Let me ask you, tell me about, because everybody knows Keltner as the studio drummer, but what stood out to you about his feel, especially playing Latin jazz or gypsy jazz with Gabor? You there, Jimmy?
I'm a 2 and 4 kind of guy, and Keltner can go on into the stratosphere of mathematics as far as drumming goes, and I knew that, when we went to the Lighthouse, I made sure that I got there early enough, and I got a seat. Jim was had set up as he looked at the stage. He was all the way to the right, and I got a chair that was just right there. Just right there. I could just look right up through his hi-hat and snare, and he was just right. I could have reached out and grabbed his bass drum pedal, and Jim can really play jazz if he would. Jim's really a jazz cat.
It's his true love. It's his true love. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's his. Like you were saying earlier, I've even heard him refer to himself as a jazz snob.
He tells me that all the time. No, and the thing is that there are cats. Basically, when you went back to Tulsa for that minute of time, but I mean, Keltner in the '70s, so much of his playing was quote unquote pop rock, but there was always jazz inflection in those tunes to the point where the bass player Larry Klein has dubbed him the Elvin Jones of rock.
Yeah. I'll buy that. I mean, Jim can pull rabbits out of a hat, drumnically. And I've heard Jim play over the years. I was happy to hear, but I was sad that I couldn't be there. Oh, I don't know. This is a couple of years ago. I've just got an acquaintance who was an old. He played drums when he was a kid, and I think he got off too far into drugs or alcohol or something.
Yeah.
And he quit playing years and years and years ago, years before I even met him. But we keep in touch, and it's been about a year, maybe a year and a half or something. He said, "You don't believe it." He said, "Keltner and I don't know if it was Albert Stinson or who, I forget who the other guys were, but Keltner said, yeah, I'll do it." And they played some joint in Hollywood, played just full out jazz.
How long? About what year would you say? Recently?
Oh yeah. This has been in the last 2 years at the most.
Wow.
And I don't think they did it a lot. I think they went in, and they maybe played a Friday and Saturday night, and then 6 months later they did it again. And, maybe they've done it another time or two. I've got this old friend of mine, Jim Roop. He keeps up with everything, especially Keltner. Being an old drummer, an old retired drummer. And he's known Keltner for years, and just he's one of those guys that's just got his ear to and knows about everything that's going on. And I talked to him a couple of times a year, and he called up and he said, next weekend, he said, I'm going down to so-and-so, some joint right in Hollywood. And he said, Keltner's playing down there. And it was a jazz situation. Keltner wasn't playing with one of them.
Oh man, I mean that they kept that so under the radar because that thing would have been blown out.
Yeah.
But Jimmy, we're gonna let's just call this a wrap for set one. But next week I'd love to do set two with you if you'd be up for it.
Oh, you want me to call back? And
Well, no, I'll call you. I'll call you, and we'll set up a time to do it, and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
And I also need to figure out how I'm going to get you the copy of this. I mean, I guess maybe we can do this off air, but you don't really use the internet, and that's fine. I just got to figure out how to. This is an important interview, and the other one will be good too. So it's good. It would be good for your records, you know.
Well, I'd love to have a copy. If you could run off a DVD, that's
A CD. I can burn a CD of it for you.
I mean, yeah.
And
I'll
mail, and I'll get your address and mail it to you.
Okay.
Also, I want to, that cat in Oklahoma City, Cleve, that old school drummer, I'd love to connect with him for an interview too, if he's up for it.
Cleve Warren. I mean, he's unbelievable. One of his favorite stories he tells is being in the pro drum shop, and Shelly Mann came in, and Cleve was up. Old Bob Yates used to keep. They may still keep all their hi hats right in the window, in the front window. And Cleve happened to be up there, and Shelly Mann came in, and they were standing side by side. Shelly goes, He said, I'm looking at all these hi hats. He said, I don't know. He said, I need a new hi hat. And he looked at Cleve and he said, well, what do you think? And Cleve said, well, I think it was a Sonar at the time or something. Cleve grabbed one. He said, I really like this one right here. And Shelley looks at him. He says, well, great. He said, and he grabbed it and he just hollered at Bob Yates, who the guy who used to, everybody. He said, just put it on my tab and walked out the door. Cleve knows everybody. He knows that Mike Finnegan that you were talking
Well, no,
about.
the funny thing, what's amazing is that Cleve Warren is a dear friend of mine on Facebook and always comments on the posts that I put. I know him very well. When you said the name, I said, I know Cleve. Cleve's the man.
Oh, Cleve knows everybody and knows he's unbelievable. He's retained more. He's met more people and retained more information. My mind's, I'm like I say, time has warped my mind.
Well, I mean, it's part of my job is to promote and preserve some of these really amazing sessions, like the one from Jameson that we heard. You make sure to look that one up, and I'm heading off to
Bob on that one.
I'm heading off to. I'm heading off to San Francisco for a week, but when I get back into town, I'll give you a call. We'll set up a time to do set two, and I'll get your address and mail you a copy of this as well, okay?
Okay. All right, Jake. I really enjoyed it, man.
Hey, man, it was so great to connect with you, Karstein, and I know I'm going to send this on to Keltner. It's going to bring a huge smile to his face. I hope you guys get a chance to see each other sooner than later, man. Because
I'm overdue. I'm going to give him a call.
Give him a call, man. Give him a call. Tell me you had a ball.
Yeah.
Tell him you had a great time on my program, man. He'll love that, man.
I will.
Yeah.
I definitely will. I'm overdue. The ball's in my court. I need to call him.
Move the ball. You got to move the ball around.
Yeah, sure enough.
All right, Karstein. Much love to you, man.
All right. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and
We'll do it again.
I'll talk to you again.
All right, bud. Later.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Jimmy Karstein, legendary drummer and a modest individual, just what his generation was about. I'm off to Napa Valley on assignment. I'll be back next week. Until then, peace.